don't know if I could do this. This is so much going on. Our relationship has always been in Spanish, so it's weird to us if we tried to change it.
Do you feel like there's a part of your personality that she hasn't got the chance to know because you only speak Spanish and not English? Do you think that some people are better at imitating accents than others?
If my Spanish hadn't advanced, I don't know if our relationship would have gotten to that level.
Who invented the arepa?
Oh, I knew you would ask this.
So great to meet you, man.
Likewise. No, I appreciate you, reaching out and setting this up. Excited to talk with you.
Yeah, ever since I saw your first, or the first video that I saw of yours on Instagram, I was like, whoa, he speaks like a Colombian. This is incredible. I'm realizing now that I only know you by your Instagram handle, which is Otro Gringo Más. I don't actually even know your name. Is that the way you normally keep it, or?
No, so my name is Duncan. I'm happy giving out Duncan is my name. I try not to give out my last name, but
yeah, Duncan. Okay.
Duncan works. Yeah.
I'm really interested in getting to know you a little bit better and getting to know how you ended up in Colombia, how you speak Spanish so well. I have like a million questions, but let's take it back to the beginning. Where are you from? Where were you raised? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so I'm from Washington D.C. Born and raised here in the city in Washington D.C. I'm actually here now. At my parents' house. So I'm from DC, I always joke with my friends in Spanish that I'm gringo de pura cepa, right? Like I'm very much, American from here, no Hispanic background or anything. I went to a small school up in Maine for college. And then after that, I ended up moving to Panama. And that's kind of what really kickstarted, my whole language learning process. I had a little bit of background. I had an academic background before that, but obviously learning Spanish in the classroom is one thing, living it's a completely different thing.
Totally. So before you went to Panama, you didn't have a lot of international experience?
Not too much, no. So in college, I was a Spanish major in college. That's why I say I have that academic background, right? I majored in Spanish and economics. I did economics. I thought that's like a serious major. That would be good for jobs. And then I did Spanish because it was fun. And I've never used my economics background, but I have used my Spanish. So it's kind of funny how it works out. And I did study abroad in Spain for a semester. So I spent, a few months in Madrid my junior year, which helped a lot. Came back with a slight Spanish accent. But even still, that was a very brief time that it helped me get a lot better. But I was far from fluent when I returned and when I moved to Panama.
So you said your original motivation for studying economics was to get a job. What was your initial motivation to study Spanish?
It kind of just fell together. It was something that I liked. And then in high school, I took, Spanish all throughout high school, because I think we could choose between Spanish, Latin, or French. And I was like, I'm not going to say Latin. It's dead language. Don't really want to do that. French, I was like, okay. But like Spanish is widely spoken throughout the Americas. Like I hear Spanish every day. It'd be really practical. Who would have learned Spanish? But I chose that. And then I took, I guess advanced placement classes, what they're called. So I had a good level when I got into college that allowed me to place into a high level of Spanish. So I figured, all right, well, I'm already starting at a high level. I can actually get to interesting courses pretty quick. I like the language. I think it's practical. Might as well study it, and I'm very, very glad that I did that because, it really opened up my professional career.
So when you placed at a high level in university, was that just because of the high school courses, or were you also like speaking it with people?
Just because of high school, honestly, like that. I had really, really good teachers, and they prepared us well for that, exam. In the U.S., like there's AP classes where you can take an exam at the end of the year and you get a score between 1 to 5. And if you get a 4 or 5, I think it depends on the college. A lot of colleges will accept that as like the equivalent of an entry level course, right? So I just had that good academic background. I think there were definitely some other factors that helped, right? So for example, I had a babysitter growing up from El Salvador, Ceci, who was amazing. She's like my second mom. And I would hear her speaking Spanish. I think that motivated me to, want to study Spanish. We would never talk in Spanish, mostly because, I was kind of embarrassed, she's fully bilingual, speaking Spanish, speaking English perfectly, and then here I'm coming and just butchering her native language. So I was definitely a little bit shy to speak a language, but he definitely motivated me to learn it. And so I got very fortunate. I had, motivation. I had really great teachers. I was able to place in a good level, and that kind of kickstarted the academic part of my Spanish language learning.
I mean, that's cool that you were able to learn it at high school to a decent level, because I feel like I hear from a lot of people with foreign languages, when they say they learned it in high school, it's almost synonymous with, but I didn't really learn anything. Like here in Canada, the more common language to study in high school would be French, right? And so you hear a lot of people say, like, oh, well, do you speak French? Well, I mean, I took it in high school, but that means I don't speak French. So the fact that you were able to actually learn it in that environment is great. And I do think that if you're motivated to learn a language, you can make it work. And if you're not, there's potential to fall through the cracks in, the academic system. I remember in university, I took a lot of different languages. I took Spanish, I took German, and I took one semester of Mandarin Chinese. And there were kids that really took it seriously and wanted to learn. And, I think I was kind of probably in that group more so because I'm very interested in languages. But there were also people that just coasted. They were at very high levels of language classes, like German, for example, and they couldn't really speak the language. And so the difference was just that I really wanted to be there, and I think some other people didn't want to be there. And so I think that probably contributes to that too.
Yeah, and I do think the academic side prepares you for learn the language in an academic way, right? Like, when I was in college, I had a good level of Spanish in the sense that I could write you a 20-page essay, right, on Jorge Luis Borges, right? And, about his works. And that was great. Could I have a conversation with my neighbor? No. Right. And so that's where you get that. And I think that happens in high school a lot as well. People they can write you a short essay, understand some of the grammar. But when it comes to speaking, they never got that part. A lot of it is probably embarrassment as well, right? People just they're ashamed to try and speak a language and not have it be perfect. But I think, the academic prepares you for academia, right? Whereas, if you're out in the world and talking with your neighbor and trying to buy fruit and go to the supermarket, that's where you can actually get that conversational skill.
I mean, in my classes in university, I did feel like they were training us to be really good passively at languages. Listening comprehension, reading comprehension. When it came to actually producing the language, especially speaking, like writing maybe more so, but especially speaking, I felt like we didn't get a ton of practice. Was that your experience as well?
For sure. And I think it's one of those things it wasn't for want of trying, right? Or lack of trying. I remember there would be conversation clubs, they try and, RG during the class, you only speak Spanish, but that's, maybe 2 hours a week when the whole rest of your university experience is in English. So, it's going to be very difficult to actually make that work. And at the same time, I think oftentimes they have a lot of pressure to, okay, there's a university course, you need to be studying literature or studying film. So they always put that other spin on it, which was fascinating. It was great. I loved it. But at the expense of conversation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the speaking practice for me was presentational. Like, get up there and talk about this historical site in Mexico. We'll talk about that for 5 minutes, but there's no back and forth really, right? It's just me sitting up there, just like struggling to say the lines that I've written down and memorized. It's a very different muscle that you're kind of exercising, I think. So what brought you to Panama then? After you finished university, you were graduated, and then you went to Panama?
So basically going into my senior year at university, I had no idea what I wanted to do, right? I had coached baseball every summer. Like, I thought I was going to try and be a teacher maybe. Didn't really know. And there's a program in the U.S. called the Fulbright program where they offer grants to, study or research or teach in other countries for a year. And so I heard about that and it sounded something really interesting. I definitely wanted to travel. I was really interested in traveling. And so I figured, I might as well apply. I probably won't get it. It's a difficult thing to get. But, I don't lose anything throwing my hat in the ring. So going into my senior year, I applied to be an English teaching assistant in Panama. Um, Basically, I wanted to go to, a Latin American country to try and put my Spanish into use, right? Actually, make that jump from academic Spanish to practical Spanish. And I wanted to be in a country where baseball was culturally significant. I played baseball my whole life. I played baseball in college. I coached in the summers. So I wanted to have that as like a connection. And if you think of Latin American countries you have that are big on baseball, you have, Dominican Republic, you have Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Venezuela, Panama, a little bit of Colombia, a little bit of Nicaragua, and that's about it. And so I started going through it, and I was like, all right, well, Venezuela and Cuba are off the books, right? Just this is a State Department grant. Those countries is not going to be feasible. Puerto Rico, U.S. territory, not going to be feasible. And then I started thinking about the other ones, like, well, the Dominican Republic is such a good baseball country. I really wouldn't even be able to contribute anything there, right? They're already saturated with cams, with people. I'm not going to do much good there. Mexico fascinated me, but I figured out, that is somewhere later in life I'll definitely be able to have an opportunity to work, hopefully. If this works out, Mexico and the U.S. have such a great relationship. Hopefully something will come up. And I started looking into Panama a bit more, and I realized the history of Panama is fascinating, especially Panama and the U.S. Very unique relationship. Baseball is something that's pretty big there. And so I figured the more and more I looked into it, Panama seemed like a perfect place for me. So, I wrote my application, applied, and then kind of just forgot about it until I was about to graduate. I think it was about a month before I was about to graduate. I already had a job lined up in California. I was getting ready to move out there. And then I got an email saying, congrats, you've been selected to teach in Panama. Like, we'll see you there in a few months. So I said, okay, great. And, after graduation, I spent a few months back home. And then in December 2014, I moved to Panama. So that was kind of sorry. That was a long-winded answer.
No. I love the history of it because there's always more to it than just, oh, I bought a plane ticket, right? There's always like kind of a build up to the motivation behind that. So you went there in 2014. How long did you stay in Panama for?
I was in Panama for about 11 months. I think my grant period was 10 months, but I stayed for an additional month. And I fell in love with Panama. It's an amazing country, amazing people. And I met my wife there. My wife is Venezuelan. Her family had migrated to Panama around the same time I arrived in Panama, actually, because of the situation in Venezuela. And so it was really cool that when I met my wife in April, we were both kind of exploring Panama at the same time, right? She was working a lot, working very, very hard. But we still find time on the weekends to try and, check out a new bar or, walk along a new part of the city, check out the historical districts. And I owe most of my experience, most of my, achievements to those 10 months in Panama. That really kind of set me off on a pretty amazing path.
And you were there teaching English. That was the job you were doing.
Yeah. So the way Fulbright works is really interesting. It's 25 hours a week as an English teaching assistant. So you are not an accredited teacher, and they're not going to throw you into high school and have you be the English teacher, because what they want to do is basically assist local English teachers. So basically be, a native speaker who can help the local English teacher, with their classwork. So I worked at a university, Universidad del Istmo, and they're basically usually I helped out with their night classes and then a couple of their day classes and some of their after school programs for high schoolers. And so basically what I would do is in the English department, I would kind of just assist with various tasks. So, let's say they had a class on pronunciation, the teacher would bring me in or the professor would bring me in and I could help be an example, right? I created an English club for, passionate students who wanted to keep practicing. So before class or after class, you could start, we can converse more and give them opportunities to help. At the high school where the university also helped out, I would come in and assist with activities and lead little English sessions. And that was 25 to 30 hours a week. And then the program also encourages you to, do a side project basically. So what I did is I started helping out as a PE teacher at a local elementary school as an additional teacher there. And then based on that, I created a youth baseball team. So I was working with kids from, probably 5 years old to 13. And I chose a group of fifth graders who, are really passionate about baseball. And I had connections here in the U.S. who sent me down a bunch of baseballs, helmets, bats, everything. They sent it down to Panama, and we just created a team and started playing. And so that was kind of the other half of my week. One half would be teaching English, helping to teach English rather, and then the other half would be coaching baseball and working as a PE teacher.
Ah, that's cool. So you were able to incorporate your love for baseball into what you were doing down there.
Exactly.
And then, so like I imagine that when you're working in the classroom, it's an English class, you're probably using a lot of English. Outside of that, in your personal life and doing the baseball coaching, were you using more Spanish or were you using more English at that point?
Spanish, 100% Spanish. I think one of the keys to my, success in learning Spanish is that I was very stubborn, right? Outside the classroom, I refused to speak English. So, every morning I would wake up and class started, I think, at 7 a.m. So I wake up, around 5:36, turn on the radio, local radio, to listen, to Spanish while I was getting ready. I'd buy a newspaper and make sure I read it cover to cover on the way to, on the bus ride to the class. And then with professors, with the kids, only speaking Spanish, even to the point where my wife and I, when we started dating down there, we only spoke Spanish. She saw me the first time and correctly assumed that I was a gringo, right? So she spoke to me in English. Me being very stubborn, replied to her in Spanish. And eventually I won that battle. We really only spoke Spanish. So I was definitely dedicated to practicing Spanish as much as possible, obviously outside the classroom setting.
I mean, I feel like you have to do that, and it's surprising that more people don't. Like the easiest thing to do is just to default to English, right? That's the easiest. You just a lot of places people will understand you speaking English, and you don't have to make yourself uncomfortable or make yourself vulnerable, maybe is even a better way to say it, where I'm going to make mistakes, I'm going to stumble through these sentences. A lot of places you don't have to do that. But the fact that you're like, no, I'm going to force myself to sit in this and to learn and to get better and to make mistakes. I mean, that's where real growth comes from. I can relate to that as well. Sometimes I feel stubborn in learning other languages because I'm so adamant that I want nothing to do with English. I don't want to speak English at all. I remember I did an exchange program in Germany through my university, and I decided before I arrived in Germany, I am not going to speak a word of English to any German people. I was in an international exchange program, so my classmates were from the U.S. and Canada and England, and so I wasn't going to speak German with them. That seemed like it would be kind of weird. But with German people, I was like, I made a rule. No English. For this month that I'm here, I'm only going to speak German. And I think my German really benefited from that, And so even now with your wife, do you guys only speak Spanish together?
We only speak Spanish. Yeah. And my wife's fluent in English, with my family, for example, my family only speaks English, right? So with them, she speaks in English. With our friends here, she'll speak English. But our relationship has always been in Spanish. So it's weird to us if we tried to change it.
Yes.
A couple times if we're talking with my parents or whatever, all in English, and she'll direct something to me in English. I'm like, why are you talking to me in English? Our relationship has been a different language. So it's definitely, we like to preserve that. We want to keep it in Spanish. It's definitely something that we've talked about, when we have kids, if we're fortunate enough to have kids, we definitely want to speak to them in Spanish so they don't lose that, because unfortunately that happens a lot here in the US, right? Where you have parents who speak a different language, but then to assimilate to U.S. culture, they lose it. So that's something that's been very important to us is keeping our relationship in Spanish.
And I think that once you establish that initial pattern, like you're describing, it is hard to change that later. What you start in is really the easiest to continue in. And I've had that experience before, trying to change language. I had a girlfriend from the Philippines, and we started our relationship in English. And then probably 2 years into the relationship, I was learning the language. I was learning to speak Tagalog at that point, and I wanted to change it. I wanted to speak more Tagalog. And so we did, but it was awkward. There was a weird transition period. And then we did two more years of only speaking Tagalog. So we kind of had both, but in those 2 years speaking Tagalog, it also started to feel weird speaking English, with my family, like you're saying too. Like once you establish that pattern, it's very hard to deviate from it. I mean, even thinking of like relationships that I have like with, friends and family, imagining having a conversation with my dad in Spanish or something like that, if he spoke Spanish, would be weird, right?
Absolutely.
Because we have our entire lives just speaking this one language. So
absolutely. And I also do feel like, I don't know if you have the same experience, your personality changes a little bit based on the language, right? In Spanish, I'm a little more close, right, with the people around me. I think English can be a bit cold sometimes. So in English, I'm a bit more distant, but I love making more jokes, right, to kind of break the ice. Whereas in Spanish, I'm much more expressive, right, but maybe not as jokey, if that makes sense. And so trying to switch that, do that code switch with your family, with your significant other, it's weird. It's like I feel like a different person, if I'm talking to them in a different language.
So then let me ask you this. In your relationship with your wife, you only speak Spanish. And so more or less, and from the beginning, you said it was like that. So more or less, she knows you as the Spanish speaking version of yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so do you feel like there's a part of your personality that she hasn't got the chance to know because you only speak Spanish and not English?
Yeah, a little bit. And it's been something actually I think it's been really great for us developing, as a couple, is that as we've, matured together, she's gotten to see that other side of me, especially now that we're in the United States, So for example, last weekend I was at a wedding. We're both at a wedding of a good friend of mine in Arizona. And so it was all, very American crew, right? At a very American wedding. And she, got to participate and see how I am in that type of environment. And it's great. It's great being able to kind of reveal more bits to yourself with your partner. Definitely at first, she always kind of, would give me some grief, being like, the first time she saw me speaking with my, American friends, she was like, "Who are you?" Like, it felt very foreign to her. But obviously, as, we've, been together almost 10 years now, she's gotten to see that side of me.
And so that means that, obviously your Spanish, it sounds amazing, but even when you guys were first going out, you had a good enough level of Spanish that you could express your personality like sufficiently. Like she got to know you enough just through Spanish. You were able to talk to her and express who you were.
Yeah, luckily I had a good enough level where I could, communicate, and we could, we could have a relationship. I'm very thankful that it worked out as it did, because as you get more and more into a relationship, your conversations evolve, right, to become more mature. Like how you know each other changes. And so luckily my language developed the same pace as my relationship with my wife, right, where I was able to eventually start expressing those deeper emotions, express those deeper concerns or fears or hopes and dreams. I was able to advance and be able to do that. I do think if my Spanish hadn't advanced, I don't know if our relationship would have gotten to that level, right? Just because communication is so key to any relationship.
That's very interesting that your language skills were developing at the same time as the relationship was. That's really cool. And what better way to learn a language, right?
Absolutely. No, I think also part of it is that, talk about motivation, right? I was falling in love with this woman. I was falling in love with her family, her culture. That motivated me to improve my language even more, right? Because I wanted to be able to be fully immersed in her and her culture and everything. So that provided that last little push to really make sure my language continued to evolve.
Right. The motivation to keep learning and to not stop. And then also the opportunity to continually use the language, right? Having someone to speak with. I mean, if you're dating somebody, or if you're married to somebody, you're talking to them so much. And if that's in a new language, that's like a life hack for getting your hours of practice in, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, you're getting your 10,000 hours pretty quick,
So you're from the U.S. She's from Venezuela. You met in Panama. How do you guys end up in Colombia?
So we always joke, we meet new people in Colombia. They say, "Oh, okay, perfect. Pam, you must be Colombian." No, I'm Venezuelan. "Oh, okay, but you guys met here in Colombia." No, we met in Panama. So, how did this happen? So basically, when I moved to Panama, when I first, going back, my senior year of college, right, I applied for the Fulbright grant going into my senior year. And then I hadn't heard back from the program in months, so I started applying to other jobs. I had got a job working in tech out in California. So my plan was after college, graduate and move out to California, start working out there. When I got word that I'd been accepted, to the scholarship program to Panama, I called up the company, the person who recruited me and said, "Hey, thanks for everything, but I'm going to go to Panama, right? This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. I can't pass it up." And luckily, it was a big enough company where they said, "You know what? That's totally fine. Like, go for it. We're happy for you. Go ahead, go to Panama. When you come back, we'll have a job waiting for you." Because they basically always hire people right out of college. So they knew there'd be a new class of college, grads. So they just basically pushed me back a year and a half. So that was great. So when my time in Panama was finished, I had a job lined up in California. And now when my wife and I started dating in Panama, I told her, "Hey, this is great. You're great. But when I leave the country in November, our relationship ends." Right? Obviously, we get to November and, I started saying, "Well, let's try long distance. Let's give it a shot." Right? And so I was out in California. She was still in Panama, and we were long distance for about 2 years. About a year in, I'd fly down to Panama every 3 months. We'd meet up in Mexico sometimes. She didn't have a visa, so she couldn't come to the U.S. We just kind of meet up along the way. About a year in, we realized, all right, this is terrible, right? We need to actually either break up or fight for this and be together, right? Find a place where we can physically be together. And so that's what we did. I started looking for jobs in Latin America. The company I was working at had offices in Mexico City, in Colombia, in Lima, in Buenos Aires. And so I started trying to network. And honestly, we really liked Colombia, but the office there was small. So I figured that's never going to happen. Like, that role is never going to open up. And if it does, they're not going to hire this gringo from California, right? It's not going to happen. So I started applying for jobs in Mexico. My wife and I we went to Mexico for 2 weeks, Mexico City, just so I could network with people in the office. So that if a job opened up, they'd know me when I applied for it, but nothing opened up. And then a friend reached out and said, "Hey, I know you're looking at jobs in Mexico City, but a job actually just opened up in Colombia, and it actually looks like you'd be a pretty good fit for what they're looking for." And so I reached out, talked to the hiring manager, did a bunch of interviews, and got very fortunate, and they selected me for the role. So I was able to transfer to, the role in Bogota, Colombia, and my wife moved to Colombia with me, and that's when we started living together. This was in December 2017.
And so you said that you guys, you liked Colombia. Had you done some trips already? Like, had you visited Colombia before that?
Yeah, I had. So when my time in Panama finished, I did a little backpacking trip with a friend, where we flew from Panama City to Medellin, and we bused to Bogota, went to Cali, went to the Coffee Triangle, then went down to the sur, a place called Ipiales, crossed the border, went into Ecuador, then, explored Ecuador, went into Peru, and finished it off with the Inca Trail in Peru. And, Colombia was the first experience. It was the first country in South America I visited. And on that brief visit, we were in the country for maybe 3 weeks. I fell in love with it. It was a beautiful place. And my wife, she'd also visited Bogota and Medellin, and she was talking to a friend who had moved there. It was like, one day I'm going to live in Bogota. Like, she was convinced, like, that's going to happen eventually. And she actually had a lot of family and friends in Colombia, right? Just because, it shares a border with Venezuela. She has family who has dual citizenship. So we always liked Colombia because of that. It felt very similar. If you ask Venezuelans, it feels very culturally similar to Venezuela, right? Obviously, there are a lot of differences, but there's still sister countries. So we liked it because of that. And, we got very fortunate that things worked out how they did, where a role opened up. They're looking for someone with my profile, and we were able to make it work.
I mean, that's an adventure. That sounds like quite an adventure.
It was.
Okay, so for somebody that has a history in Colombia, but also a connection with Venezuela, let me ask you this controversial question. Who invented the arepa?
Oh, I knew you were gonna ask this.
No, this is a tough question, because if I answer one way, my family disowns me, right? My wife's family disowns me. If I answer the other way, Colombia's going to rescind my residency. So
you can't win.
I say the arepa belongs to whoever makes it.
Okay.
Whoever's doing it, it's theirs. If you are making a Venezuelan style arepa, that arepa is Venezuelan. If you're making a Colombian style arepa, then it's Colombian. I'm gonna back out of that question. Yeah.
Very, very diplomatic. Yeah, you got to be careful with that one. There's a lot of controversy there, a lot of discussions around that one. So you moved to Colombia in 2017, and how long? Like you're back in the States now. Are you living in the States full time, or are you still like back and forth?
So we are in the States now. We were in Colombia for 6.5 years. Moved back to the States. My parents have some health issues, so they needed us to be home. So we moved back here to kind of take care of them, make things a little bit easier for them. So that's why we moved. We still, we went to Colombia last month. We're going to go back in March. I might go back before then. We're still going to be going a lot to Colombia, but we are now residing, I guess, in the United States.
And so for the 6.5 years that you were living there, were you also coming back and forth to the States somewhat?
I'd come back usually maybe once, twice a year. Usually to visit my parents. Sometimes there'd be a wedding or something, but I would not spend significant time in the U.S., right? My job was in Colombia. My wife was in Colombia. That's where I wanted to be, right? And in the pandemic, for example, when everything shut down, I had some, friends in Colombia who were from different countries. A lot of them went back to their home countries for the pandemic. I stayed in Colombia because that's where kind of I had, our wife and I, we had made our life there. So I would visit the United States, but definitely not, with the intent of trying to split time between the two countries. When I was in Colombia, I was, fully there.
Yeah, and 6.5 years is a big chunk of time. That is more than enough time to make, like you said, make a life there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I talk about Colombia a lot with a lot of fondness because, it allowed my wife and I to actually live together for the first time. We got married there. We adopted a dog there. I grew professionally so much in Colombia. I worked with so many amazing people and had so many amazing opportunities there. You really loved it, but, that's kind of how life goes. So you can't really predict what's going to happen next. I had a very immediate need to come back here, a very urgent need. I left Colombia. We left pretty quick, honestly. And, I would do it again in a heartbeat, right? Family always comes first.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's kind of funny how life goes. I would never have expected, 15 years ago that I would have spent, fallen in love with Venezuela, moved to Colombia, had this amazing experience. I did not have it didn't see it in the cards.
So out of the countries that you've spent some time in, like Panama, you said you do that backpacking trip through Ecuador, Peru. I imagine you've been to Venezuela as well.
No, so I need a visa to enter Venezuela, and because I'm American, and I will not get it. There was a point in time where my wife had a friend whose father worked in politics, and she was going to help. She was going to ask him to help me get a visa so she could take me to Venezuela. And he was very receptive, like, sure, we can do this. And then he saw my picture, saw my profile, and he's like, no, it's not safe for him. This was back in 2000, must have been 2017, 2016, maybe. So things were a little bit different. But it was very much like, no, this guy, if he goes there, he's immediately going to be made a political prisoner. And with how things are right now, I wouldn't feel safe going back, or going there rather. So one day I really hope to get to know Venezuela. I really want to explore it. My wife still has, her grandmother lives there. She has a bunch of family that lives there. I've heard so many amazing things about the country. I really want to go there, but politically it's not possible at this time.
Yeah, it's definitely not the most stable country, right? It definitely has some issues. So that makes sense. And I mean, watching your videos, like obviously your wife is Venezuelan, but you sound very Colombian to me. I mean, I'm not an expert on the matter, but you sound way more Colombian than Venezuelan.
I do. I think I also will get some grief from my wife and her family on that but obviously when we were long distance, right? My Spanish had more of a Venezuelan, twang to it because my main references were, Venezuelans, right? But then when I moved to Colombia, I would speak obviously with my wife and a lot of her friends or family only, who were Venezuelan. but my day-to-day working was with Colombians, right? So just by association, I do have more of a Colombian accent. There are certain things I'll say more Venezuelan, but I think overall my accent is closer to Colombia than it is to Venezuela.
Do you think that some people are better at imitating accents than others?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's some people who just have a gift. It's amazing. I follow a lot of people who speak different languages. I think you are a prime example. Your ability to fully adapt to a language is incredible. And there's some people who just have that gift. I also know, for example, I know some other Americans in Colombia, a guy I met and would play some sports with. He's been there for 20 years, speaks perfect Spanish grammatically, but has a very gringo accent. And he's just come to peace with it. He's been like, you know what? Like, I've tried to get it. My tongue just doesn't work that way, right? He learned it later on in life, and it's fine. As long as someone understands you and you can you can get your point across, it's fine. But there are definitely some people who have a gift for, imitating the accent and be able to fully speak like a local.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, grammatically speaking, I do think that anybody has the ability to learn another language and to be very fluent in the language and understand the grammar and how it works and everything. The accent, you do see a bit of a divide between people where you meet somebody and you're like, you speak very well, but that accent is so far off from how the natives sound. Versus people like yourself who it's like, wow, I feel like I'm listening to a Colombian. And so, like, what do you credit that to? Like, how do you think you were able to develop that Colombian accent so well?
Yeah, I think part of it is that I've always liked accents in general. Like, so for example, DC does not have a particularly strong accent, right? If you meet someone from DC, you're not going to be able to immediately pinpoint they're from DC. It's not like a Boston accent. It's not, a New York accent. It's not, a California accent or a Southern accent. It's pretty neutral. And so because of that, and it's also because it's a very international and cosmopolitan city, I would see a lot of people with different accents. And when I went up to school, I get a whole, New England accent. And I love just imitating my friends and imitating people I met and making fun of them a little bit, And so I love trying to do that. I don't know if I was necessarily good at it in English, but, I would try to do it. And so learning Spanish is the same way. It's like, all right, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to try and sound as credible as possible. So I tried to imitate the accents, right? So first when I went to Spain, I tried to speak more Spanish, right? Then when I was in Panama, I tried to speak more Panamanian. Around my wife's family, I'll try to speak a little bit more Venezuelan. And so I think I credit it a lot to, one, trying to actually listen to what makes, the accent different. Two, trying to immerse yourself as much as possible, right? So, living in Medellin, talking with my coworkers are all paisas, right? Consuming paisa literature, and literature, I guess, doesn't really help the accent, but, movies, TV shows, things like that. And then lastly, like, honestly, it's kind of funny. If you make fun of an accent, like, burlándose, oftentimes it sticks, right? So if you over exaggerate at first, like, oftentimes it'll come out as actually like a pretty good accent.
Yeah, because you're kind of accentuating the distinct features of the accent. You're noticing the differences. You said you're interested in accents and imitating that and kind of getting into the phonology of a language or a dialect. How much of it is linguistic and how much of it is trying to assimilate into the group that you're with?
That's a really good question. I think for me, it's more the assimilation. I think that's kind of what did it for me. I haven't formally studied linguistics, right? Or, phonology. I couldn't tell you, the tongue shape or, the vocal sound. I couldn't do that, right? I think it's fascinating. I love reading tidbits on how different languages evolved. But for me, it's more like, all right, if I'm working in Medellin, if all my coworkers, the team that's working for me, they're all paisa, well, I want to speak like them. I want to have that credibility, right? I don't want to be the foreigner coming in and trying to shake things up, right? I think I'm coming into their culture, into their company. I'm the one who needs to adapt, right? So part of that is not just speaking a language, but trying to actually sound, like I belong. So I think that assimilation for me was the biggest factor, or the biggest motivating factor.
I mean, that's a fantastic motivation, and I can relate to that so much. Like just wanting my interaction with the people I'm with to be as seamless as possible. I don't want to stand out. I don't want to be, like different. I think that for us, that might seem obvious. Hey, I'm working with a bunch of Paisa people. I should learn how to speak like a Paisa, right? I interact with a lot of Filipinos. I want to speak Tagalog like a Filipino. I think the truth is we're probably in a minority of people that are really committed to doing things like that. I think that there's a subset of society that is so interested in like immersing themselves in a different culture and wearing different hats depending on the groups that they're with. And where does that come from? Like how does someone develop that way of thinking?
I don't know. That's a really, really good question. I don't know. I think it might be, a personality thing. I've always tried to be more of a people pleaser. I'm not particularly confrontational. If there's a fight going on, I'm usually the person who tries to go in the middle and break it up, as opposed to the one who comes in throwing haymakers, right? And so I think part of that is, all right, you want to appease to a lot of different people. You want to be, the best way to diffuse a situation is make everyone feel welcome. And I think I got a lot of that philosophy, when I was coaching, when I was teaching, trying to make, my students or everyone else feel included. And so I think that became a logical extension when I was trying to learn Spanish, right? It's, all right, I like it when people include me, right? So if I'm going to be in this language, I want to make them feel included. And how do I make them feel included? Me being a foreigner, I adapt to them, right? I do think it's a tricky thing, though, because you talk a lot about identity. So, for example, my wife and a lot of Venezuelans, they're never going to lose their Venezuelan accent, right? They could be living in Mexico for 30 years. They're going to still sound Venezuelan. And that's fine, right? It's a thing to hold on to their identity, right? But, for you and me, if I don't have a Spanish identity. I'm making this up as I go, basically. Okay, I'm speaking a different language. I'm going to adapt to what's around me, right? But I do think, for example, if I move to England, I'm still going to sound American. I'm not going to try and adopt a British accent, right? Because my English identity is American, right? So I don't think I have a concise answer to your question, like where it comes from. But I do think it has a lot to do with, how you value identity and how you value yourself in a social setting.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you learn a new language, you're starting with a blank slate. There are no expectations, right? It would be hard to change the way we speak English because like you said, we formed an identity through our entire lives, and it would sound forced. Like if I tried to speak as like with a British accent, it would not be convincing for one thing, but it would also might seem a little bit disingenuous. Where in Spanish, for example, it's believable that I learned Spanish in Colombia, right? That's a believable thing. And you could start that at any age.
Absolutely. And I do think what's cool about a language is that there's so much to learn, right? And vocabulary and accent go very hand in hand. At least I feel like that way in Spanish, right? So, the Spanish that I used in school is very different from the Spanish that I use in Panama, which is very different from the Spanish that I used in Colombia, which is very different from the Spanish that I use talking to my wife's family, right? And so because you already have to change your vocab for one country or another, it follows that your accent might change as well, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. They're kind of connected. And yeah, like to relate to somebody, I think the easiest way to relate to somebody if you're speaking to them is to have similar kind of jargon, colloquialisms, slang, and all of that is subject to change depending where you are in the world, right? And like you said, especially with Spanish, because it's spoken in 22 different countries. There's a lot of slang to be learned, right? Even within one language. With my experience with Tagalog, it's a little bit different because it's only spoken in one country, right? And so there are different ways of speaking depending where you are in the country. There's different accents. But the slang, I think, is more or less universal for the country. But I find
there's not as much variance.
No, there's not quite as much variance between one speaker and another speaker. But if the more slang I use, the more people kind of accept me, I think. Where it's like we have a mutual understanding that we're on this kind of the same wavelength here, right? Like,
Absolutely.
where I'm not just pretending to speak this language. I do have exposure to this language, and I'm using words that I would only know from having exposure to the language, right?
Absolutely. And I think that goes to what you're talking about, the intent. It shows, that you're making a conscious effort, right? You're only going to learn the slang. You're only going to learn, local colloquialisms if you're there making the effort and actually trying to, be immersed in the culture.
Yeah, it's like evidence that you have, like, hey, I've put the time in. On my other channel, I make all Filipino content, and like in general, I love traveling. I've been to other countries, and I enjoy that. In terms of the place that I've spent the most time in, other than Canada, it actually is Colombia. I was there for 9 months over 2 trips, so 4 months for the first trip and 5 months for the second trip, and that's where I really had probably definitely my biggest experience with culture shock and with trying to fit into a society that's so different from where I grew up. And I learned so much. I feel like I really developed as a person in those 9 months. And that's a big part of the motivation for me to do this podcast, is I recognized, hey, this like culture shock, cultural integration, whatever you want to call it, is a really big deal. And when I see people like yourself who've spent so much time living in another country, I have a kind of a newfound respect of like, wow, you've put the time in and you've overcome a very big hurdle, culturally, socially, linguistically, a lot of different ways. Was it difficult for you when you first moved to Colombia? Was it what did you have to overcome, I guess, to stay there for 6.5 years?
Yeah, I think it was difficult in a lot of different ways. I think one, immigrating is difficult for anyone, right? You're leaving your family, your friends, anything you're leaving it behind. I was very privileged as an immigrant, right? I came into Colombia with a job, with my significant other. So I definitely had it easier than most immigrants. But regardless, going to a new place where they're speaking a different language, right? That's the first hurdle. And yes, I spoke Spanish, but one thing is, speaking a few hours a day with your partner. And then the other thing is speaking it all day, every day. I remember the first few weeks I would come home from work just exhausted. I'd be exhausted every minute, every hour, every day, because I was constantly having to think double, right? I couldn't really turn off and go on autopilot in any moment, right? So I'm just being physically very tired. And then second, cultural norms, in the U.S., a lot of business is very straightforward. Your meeting's at 10, you're showing up at 10 a.m., right? You're turning on the camera, you're saying hi. How was your weekend? Good, perfect. So in this meeting, we're going to talk about XYZ. It's right to it. In Colombia, I would show up a meeting at 10 and, go to a conference room. The people in there are still finishing up their meeting. 10:15, we'd start going in, have small talk for 20 minutes, and then dive into the business, right? And I had this urge being like, no, we're here to work for business, right? Where in Colombia, it's very much like, how am I going to do business with you if I don't know you, if you don't have a connection, right? It's a different way of doing things. And that took me a while to get used to, because to build that relationship, which is so important, you need that mutual understanding, right? What we're talking about, building that connection. And I didn't have the criteria to build that connection yet. So it took me a while to get actually comfortable enough to work well, right? To be able to connect with clients, to be able to do what I needed to do. And then also to have the confidence to navigate daily life. I was living in, my wife and I rented an apartment, right? And there was a leak, right? The shower head started leaking. Okay, cool. If that happens in the US, I just called my landlord and say, hey, change this, right? Now you do this in Spanish with someone where I don't really know the power dynamic. I don't really know culturally what's accepted, what's not, right? I don't know if that's a fix that I'm supposed to do myself, because Colombians are much more handy than Americans, right? They're very good at fixing things in general. I don't know if I'm supposed to fix that, if she's supposed to fix it. I don't know if I need to contact the plumber to do it, or she's going to contact the plumber. If I contact the plumber, what's the right price? Do I then pay it and then pay her? Like, there's so much random small things that each thing individually is very small, but then I add it up. It becomes, a lot to deal with. Once again, I was very, very lucky that I was there with my wife, right? We weren't married at the time, but we were living together, and she was incredibly supportive. And I think if I'd gone there by myself, it would have been a very different experience. I would have been very lost very quickly. So while it was difficult, I did have a very much, I had an advantage in the sense I had someone who could help me with a lot of it.
Yeah, the little things, they build up. They definitely do. The things that you take for granted. And honestly, I think if you were, I mean, there was probably a universally accepted definition of what culture is. I always think of it as the thing that everybody gets, but no one has to explain.
For sure.
And so in Colombia, okay, the tap's leaking or whatever, it's understood how that's going to happen, or how we start a meeting. It's understood. No one has to say, this is how we start a meeting. People just get it. But for you and I, we don't get it, right? We have to learn that. And if no one's explaining it, you have to learn it in context and get a lot of reps in. But it is exhausting, and it does take a toll. I think the heaviest thing for me was always feeling like I was 2 steps behind everybody else.
Yeah. You were playing catch up.
I was playing catch up all the time. I felt like I kind of felt like I was like the dumbest person in the room a lot of the time. Like, people had to explain things to me that I didn't get. I'm laughing at a joke 20 seconds after everyone else is, trying to think about like, oh, what does that mean? And that got hard. And I think that, like, I was there for 9 months, but I think it takes a lot longer than that to fully assimilate. Because even at the end of the 9 months, I didn't feel like that was fully resolved. Like, oh, well, I'm caught up now. I might have been 1 step behind instead of 2, but I was definitely still behind. How long would you say it took you to fully feel comfortable? Or like, did you reach that point where you felt like, you weren't, little things weren't stacking up and weighing you down?
I feel like it definitely got easier, but I don't think I ever got to the point where I'm like, all right, this is my culture now, right? I still very much felt like, all right, I am very close to, I'm not very adjacent to this culture, but I'm still not a part of it yet, I don't know if I would ever have actually fully got in it. And I think that's fine, right? That's something that happens. I do think a turning point was 3 years into our time there. We were in Bogota. Pandemic is there, so we're still, locked up, but then starting to move around a little bit. A buddy who had worked at the same company, he was working at a different company in Medellin, and he was leaving. And he reached out to me and said, hey, this role is opening up. You'd be a great fit. Leave the company you're at now and, come to this company, move to Medellin and start there. And I remember thinking, like, can I do that? Like, this company, the company I was at brought me to Colombia. They're sponsoring my work visa. Like, do I really want to jump ship and go to this other company? It was definitely, a huge improvement, not speaking bad of where I was, right? It was just, it was a career opportunity. But I'd be in a new city, the friendships that I worked so hard to create in the last 3 years, I'm going to be in a different city, have to start again. Is that really worth it, right? And I feel like if I hadn't felt comfortable enough in the culture, I wouldn't have done it, right? My wife and I would have just stayed in Bogota and maybe come right back to the U.S. and been fine. But we felt comfortable enough where we'd be like, we can do this. Like, we can absolutely do this. This is a great career move. We can check out a new city. And we had that level of comfort that allowed us to take that leap. So that's why I would say that was kind of the moment where I felt like, you know what, I know how to navigate the world here, right? Maybe not fully 100%, in the culture. And, I'm not Colombian. I never will be Colombian. But I was comfortable enough. And I think that I had been accepted enough, right, where I could make those types of moves.
Like, if you are overwhelmed and your cup is full, you have no more room to add any new changes or evolutions or developments, like especially moving to a different city and changing your job. But if you're like, yeah, you know what, I think we could handle that. It goes to show that, the cup isn't all the way full yet. You're okay. You're handling it. Did you feel like it was still exhausting to navigate a new culture 6.5 years in, or was it less so?
No, I think very much less so. Honestly, like, I think most day to day, in terms of language, I felt like, a fish in water, right? Speaking Spanish didn't tire me out like it did at the beginning. And navigating Colombian culture, by the end, didn't seem strange to me, right? When you first move to any country, it's going to feel foreign, right? Which is natural. By the end, I felt very much used to it. There will always be certain things that stand out and could be confusing. So I still like, I remember when I was leaving the company talking about, in Colombia, you have la pensión obligatoria, then you also have fondo de protección, then you have otros fondos. There are a bunch of like institutions I still don't fully understand and never will, and that's okay. There's certain things there that, I realized, you know what, I'm just not going to get it. I'm fine with it. But it got to a point where I think if I had that early on, I would have freaked out and like, what's going on? Why don't I understand it? I got to a point where I realized, you know what? I'm not going to grasp everything. I'm not going to understand everything. And that's totally fine.
I think there's so many parallels between language and culture in that aspect as well, where like you don't have to learn everything. Like you just learn enough to get by, and the rest will come later. Also, I think the idea of like being immersed in something and just kind of slowly chipping away at it, like the language, you work with what you have, what you're able to do. And if you don't let your expectations go crazy, then, you'll be okay, kind of like slowly, incrementally getting better. Yeah, I mean, it's inspiring for me to watch your content and to talk to you now, obviously, because when I was in Colombia, it was a new experience for me to try to adapt to where I was at, and I was learning Spanish as well at the time, and I mean I still am, but that's where most of my learning happened, was in Colombia, and we were in Ibagué, right? That's why I'm.
I was about to say for the Tolima shirt, yeah,
the Tolima shirt, and we weren't in an international place, right? Ibagué is not a tourist place. It's not on the beach. It's not international. And so a lot of times I felt like I was going through something that was really big, this new culture, new language, but there was not really anyone around me that was also going through that. And so it was new for me, but it wasn't new for the people that I was with. And I went there for my girlfriend. My girlfriend is from Colombia. And so I was with her and her family and friends, and they're all, very much used to how this culture works. And I was kind of the outlier. And so when I see people like yourself and I get the chance to talk to you, it's cool because I'm like, oh, you get this too. You've been, like you're, you understand, you had to go through the same things that, that I had to go through, and we can kind of connect on that. I'm much earlier in my development than you are, with 9 months in comparison to 6.5 years. But it's cool that I can relate to so much of the stuff that you're saying. And, I feel kind of understood in a new way, I think.
No, absolutely. And I'll say it's all a curve, right? The first 6-9 months, it's like you're drinking water from a fire hose, right? It's a lot. Then eventually it curves off. And I even say the last 2 years in Colombia, did my cultural understanding improve dramatically? Did my language ability improve dramatically? No, I've kind of plateaued, right? And that's fine. Is there more to learn? Absolutely. But I've kind of plateaued. So I think the hardest part is the beginning, right? And that's what you also remember the most, that you remember those early nights where you're like, I don't know if I can do this. This is so much going on. So honestly, I applaud you for doing this. I applaud you for taking that leap, not only in Spanish, in so many other languages, because it's difficult, right? And it's something that it can be very frustrating, where some days you want to just throw in the towel, right? But getting through it is, and I think you can attest that it's so satisfying, right? Being able to actually talk with different people, understand different experiences, engage in other cultures. It's so incredibly rewarding.
Oh yeah. In terms of life experience, I think it might be one of the most difficult things you can do, but also one of the most rewarding by far. It's both of those things at the exact same time. Hey man, I really appreciate this. Thank you so much for chatting with me. I feel like I learned so much, and maybe we can have another call sometime in the future,
Absolutely. I would love to. It was a pleasure chatting with you. I have a million questions for you, so hopefully we can do it. I can learn a little more about your experience. I think you're doing amazing stuff. So once again, thank you for reaching out.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate that. And where can people find your content online?
Yep. So you can find me on TikTok or on Instagram. My handle is Otro Gringo Más. I post very random stuff, pretty much all in Spanish. So if you're trying to learn language, get a little bit more, understanding, or just want to see another gringo speaking Spanish, please give me a follow.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much, man. Take care.